Well, when I think of Mexican education under Diaz's ruling and also during the revolution, I think of really two key contributors at the state level. You have Enrique C. Rebsamen and also Enrique Lobsher, who they developed this theory on the practice of education and created a school, the model school of Orizaba, that kind of emphasized that theory and put that theory in practice. And then when you're thinking at the national level, you're thinking of Joaquin Baranda, and with the help of Justo Sierra, they focused on normal education. And Baranda's focus was primarily in training normal teachers, and he established dozens of normal schools. And after aiding Baranda in his reform, Sierra went off to focus and concentrate on federalized instruction and the reform of plans of study and programs, and he wanted to incorporate higher education in the Mexican educational system.
José Vasconcelos was a Mexican writer, philosopher, and politician who was appointed head of the newly formed Secretariat of Public Education, or SCP, in 1921. A member of the upper echelons of Mexican society, he had an elitist and paternalistic view of the poor. He was a believer in the idea that the government had a duty to improve the lives of poor Mexicans through education, as well as through the development of an aesthetic culture, specifically through literature and other arts, such as muralists. Vasconcelos also believed that Mexican Indians were holding Mexico back from progress, but did not hold the white supremacist views popular in the Porfiritorio. Instead, in his book The Cosmic Race, written in 1925, he suggested the superiority of the mixed mestizo race, which allegedly combined the best traits of Europeans and Mexican Indians. He wanted to base educational curriculums on the realities and cultures of Mexico, once criticizing a cooking class for focusing too much on European foods. As head of the SCP, Vasconcelos was placed in charge of Mexico's state universities, agricultural and industrial colleges, primary and secondary education, music and fine art conservatories, museums, and national monuments. One of his largest projects was the development of a wide network of rural schools called Casa del Pueblo, literally House of the Village, showing just how central these schools were to the villages. Children would be taught traditional school subjects, which for the first time included Spanish and Mexican history classes, part of Vasconcelos' efforts to bolster a sense of national identity, which he felt was especially lacking in the Mexican Indian population. Adults would receive instruction in farming techniques as well as classes in reading and writing. Vasconcelos also sponsored muralists, writers, and musicians, as well as mass-printed literature from writers such as Dante and Cervantes, all in efforts to boost the aesthetic culture of Mexico. Rural villages would often get boxes of these books and cheap readers for students, while in larger towns, villages, and cities, public libraries would be built. Unfortunately, this progress was not without obstacles. Often, rural teachers were poorly trained, and teacher trainers sent on cultural missions by the SCP were distrusted by the villagers, who saw them as trying to erode their long-held traditions. This distrust was especially prevalent in the Mexican Indian communities. To counter this, the SCP produced a magazine known as El Maestro, filled with tips for teachers and updated curriculums. Funding was also an issue for the SCP, with many critics stating that Vasconcelos wasted large amounts of money by printing literary classics, which would often never even be read by rural villagers. This led the government to continue to allow the Catholic Church to educate children just to meet the needs of the population. But the final nail in the coffin was the Huerta Rebellion, which disrupted education and slashed funding for the SCP, from its original 15% of the national budget in 1921 to only 6% in 1925.
José Vasconcelos was succeeded by José Puig Casaronc. Puig Casaronc's undersecretary was Moises Sáenz, and he was one who pushed for and then ultimately implemented many of the major changes during this time. Sáenz wanted to expand schooling in rural areas that Vasconcelos had really struggled to reach, and he did so with great success. Both the number of the teachers and students in the countryside increased by about 550%. The nature of that education also changed under Sáenz. Students were provided with orchards, gardens, and even small livestock to care for, so that they would be provided with practical skills on top of their studies. Communities often helped to build and maintain these schools, which quickly became cultural centers. Schools offered classes to both children and adults, and they were commonly used for community meetings. In 1931, Narciso Bassols was appointed as head of the SEP, marking the first ministerial position held by a Marxist in the Mexican government. He tried to implement a socialist education aiming to, quote, escape from the slavery of capitalism. This campaign was markedly against the church, with slogans that declared that the clergy members should be sent back to the Vatican where they belonged. Having already inflamed the church, Bassols' downfall came about when he tried to institute a sex education program. Predictably, the church was outraged, and parents urged their children to boycott the classes as they feared an increase in sexual promiscuity. He couldn't find any support from the teachers either, as they had been disgruntled by his earlier attempts to establish quality control.
The Muralist movement was a movement of artists that created murals, often on the walls of public buildings. These buildings were opened to the muralists by José Vasconcelos to promote Mexican nationalism and the gains of the revolution. The most famous artists of the Muralist movement were a group of 3 artists, known as Los Tres Grandes. This group was sponsored by the SEP and made up of Diego Rivera, David Alfaro Siqueiros, and José Clemente Orozco. In 1922, Los Tres Grandes created the Syndicate of Technical Workers, Painters, and Sculptors, an organization dedicated to establishing standards for post-revolutionary Mexican art. The syndicate published its ideology in a magazine called El Machete, which soon became an outlet for the Mexican Communist Party. The syndicate focused on indigenous peasants, soldiers, and workers, and aimed to depict their daily struggles. These paintings sought to tell the history of Mexico and aimed to clearly define the heroes and villains of its story. The first of Los Tres Grandes was Diego Rivera. Politically, he considered himself a diehard Marxist and was a member of the Mexican Communist Party. His work stressed the hard work of the Mexican people and the natural glory of their country, with many of them revealing his political leaning with symbols like the hammer and sickle. When Vasconcelos resigned, Rivera's major sponsor disappeared, and the syndicate was halted. Rivera only managed to keep his job by leaving the Communist Party, which allowed him to work several more years until he finished his murals. Those murals turned out to be some of his best work, emphasizing social justice through land reform, as well as Marxism. The next of Los Tres Grandes was David Alfaro Siqueiros. Siqueiros was a more committed Marxist than Rivera, and spent much more time on political activities. Although his murals tended to be less political than Rivera's, some did include political symbols like the hammer and sickle, which often generated outrage towards his works. When Vasconcelos resigned, Siqueiros returned to political activity, focusing on organizing workers and becoming the head of a trade union. He continued to paint murals, with most of his later works depicting the struggle against fascism. The final member of Los Tres Grandes was José Clemente Orozco. Unlike his fellow members of Los Tres Grandes, he was apolitical, even going as far as to say that those who expressed political views in their art were not artists. Unlike Rivera, he refused to portray the revolution and its leaders in terms of black and white. When Vasconcelos resigned, he was fired from the preparatory school project where he had been producing murals, though he continued to paint both in Mexico and in the US. Although the Muralist movement brought art to the common people and promoted their cause, the reception by the public wasn't entirely positive. The conservative press objected to the Marxist symbols and ideals represented in the murals, and each of Los Tres Grandes had some of their work damaged or destroyed by conservative students. The lack of appreciation eventually drove Orozco to leave Mexico for the US, where he and several of the other muralists painted commissions for the US government and for families like the Rockefellers.
Many musicians and composers wanted to create music in light of the revolution coming to an end. However, they still wanted to include the real roots of Mexico, meaning they wanted to include the history of Mexico, especially during the Porfiriato period, which was a prominent theme in many songs. Ballads were also a very popular style of music nearing the end and after the revolution. They were mainly performed in rural areas and encompassed themes similar to mariachi bands in regard to the revolution. They praised heroes like Zapata and Villa, and many ballads from the years between 1934 and 1940 talked about and discussed the want for land reform. The style of music that Mexico is most known for is mariachi. Mariachi originated in the state of Jalisco. It is a mix of Spanish, native, and African styles, and it differs from region to region. The songs mariachi bands performed during the revolution dealt with the themes of revolutionary heroes, enemies, victories, and losses. Now, mariachi is known all around the world and greatly enjoyed by all people. Now on to literature. The Revolution was so influential that a new type of literary genre called the novel of the Revolution came to be. Almost 300 books were written about the Revolution, and this period of mass publication lasted from 1915 to 1947. Mariano Azula was a doctor who helped Villa's generals during the Revolution. In 1915, he published a book called The Underdogs and became a celebrated author years later. His novel discusses the struggle of Huerta's regime and how people fought to remove Huerta. Another highly renowned author from this time was Agustin Yanez. He wrote a book called The Edge of the Storm, which is a psychological thriller that entails and describes the peasant's life before the revolution broke out. Although the end of the Mexican Revolution created its own set of conflicts and consequences, some beautiful pieces of music and highly regarded works of literature were created during and after.